kind of short this morning. I'm not kind of, I am short. I was officiating the wedding for Philip and Olivia yesterday, and it was a good time. But I thought about the sound guy, the one that did the PA system for the audio and things, and he was a lot taller than me, and just sort of a guy I looked up to, But anyway, I was glad to be able to do that. They asked me if I would be their officiant back in March or April or so, and I told them I'd be glad to do it, and I was happy I could do it. It's sort of a busy month for me because I'm going to be out of the classroom this Wednesday and the Wednesday after here. I'm speaking at a vacation Bible school at Trousdale in Warren County, and then the following week I'm going to be speaking for Morrison's summer series. So I'll be doing quite a bit of traveling over the next few weeks, but this is home for me right here. I think I've told the story before, but I'm not sure. About a few years ago when I was leaving Walmart with a few friends, we'd been in there and kind of done some looking around, and we were getting ready to get into my car and leave, and we were having, I think, some type of religious conversation about religion or something of that nature. And this fellow that none of us had met before, we didn't know who he was putting away his shopping cart, and he, I guess, overheard us and offered a little bit of his side of the conversation. But it's been a few years and the details for me are a bit blurry, but I know basically what he said was why Christians worship on Sunday, and that was the gist of what he was saying to us. He made the case that Christians worship on Sunday more so out of tradition than anything else. And I got to looking into that a little bit when I was putting together this lesson, and I think I know what he was referring to. There was an edict went out by Constantine in AD 321. Constantine was making an edict that declared that Sunday was a day of rest, his civil law. That was a declaration that he'd made in AD 321, and it basically made it easier for Christians to worship on Sunday. That was the long and the short of what it amounted to. And we might ask the question at this point, why are so many people beginning to believe that's how worship on a Sunday started for the church some 300 years after the time of Paul and Matthew and Peter and all the other apostles? Because some confuse that day of rest that Constantine started with the origin of Sunday worship. But you notice that passage that Don just read for us a moment ago. Luke wrote that in Acts, when Paul and the others were gathered there, on the first day of the week, we were gathered together to break bread. And we'll talk a little bit about that expression in a moment. But when you think about what people think about how Sunday worship started, whether they think it was started by Constantine in AD 321, we really haven't even gotten into the significance about what the Bible says about Sunday yet. And we'll do that some more in a moment, because you know, as I do, that Sunday was the day that Jesus rose from the grave. It was the day that he appeared to his apostles. It was the day that the church was started in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, and we'll address some more of those things as we go along. But our lesson this morning is titled The Lord's Day. And what I wanted for us to think about this morning is not only why worship is important, but why we do it on Sunday and why we partake of the Lord's Supper every Sunday. That's really going to be our focus this morning as we think about the Lord's Day. But I wanted to talk first of all about the Jewish Sabbath, that Sabbath day that the Jews observed under the old law, because we really can't get into the Sunday discussion without talking about that first. And well, who was the old covenant made with? We know that God made that old covenant with the Jews. That was God's marriage contract with them, if you will, because Israel was described in the Old Testament as God's bride, and he was described as their husband. They were bound to each other by that covenant relationship that they had. And Moses reminded them of that. In Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verses 2 and 3, Moses made it clear to Israel that God required Israel's obedience. He required their faithfulness. In Deuteronomy 5, 2 through 3, Moses said, "The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us who are all of us here alive today." And Exodus 20 verse 2 is another. Exodus 20, you might remember, is a passage that deals with the Ten Commandments. God said in Exodus 20 verse 2, he reminded them that he was the one that had brought them out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And God made that with Israel. God gave Israel the Sabbath primarily as a memorial so that they could remember what God had done for them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt before, when he brought them out of slavery before. In Deuteronomy 5, Moses reminded Israel about this day again. In Deuteronomy 5:15, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep this Sabbath day." And I think a good question for us to ask at this juncture, when we're tempted to think about should Christians observe the Sabbath or not, would be to ask ourselves this question: were you and I slaves in the land of Egypt? Were you and I brought out of Egypt? Did we cross through the Red Sea on dry ground, or was that Israel? Well, you and I are not Jews. That was something that God did exclusively for those Hebrew people, wasn't it? And by the way, you don't read of anyone keeping a Sabbath until Exodus, until the time of Moses. You don't read about Abraham keeping one, or Isaac, or Jacob, or Joseph. You don't read about Noah keeping one. You don't read anything about a Sabbath until the book of Exodus, because the Sabbath wasn't instituted until God made that covenant at Sinai. They had a Sabbath they observed while they were in the wilderness in Exodus 16, but that was more of a preliminary test. But the Sabbath, kept as a holy day of rest for Israel, wasn't in effect, if you will, until Sinai. In Nehemiah 9:14, the prophet of God said that you made known to them your holy Sabbath at Sinai. Well, Israel wouldn't have needed to have made it known to them if their fathers had been practicing it generations before, would they? And centuries later, during the time of Ezekiel, God said in Ezekiel 20, "I led them out of the land of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. I gave them my statutes and made known to them my rules, by which, if a person does them, he shall live. Moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths as a sign between me and them." So the Sabbath was a sign between God and Israel. It was a sign when they made that covenant at Sinai. Now, in light of those facts, should the Christian keep the Jewish Sabbath? That's a question that comes up. And I mentioned earlier, we're not Jews that have been under that Decalogue. And if you scour the New Testament from book to book and page to page, you'll find the early church didn't observe the Sabbath. Why didn't those early Christians observe the Sabbath? Because it was after Jesus died. And when Jesus died, what did Jesus figuratively nail to the cross with him? It had to have been that Old Testament law. And that's exactly what Paul said in Colossians chapter 2. Paul said that Jesus set aside that law, nailing it to the cross. And the ESV says set aside there, but when it says set aside, that means it has been permanently set aside. That's the rendering in the Greek, basically. And he says, because it's been set aside, he said to those Christians at Colossae, since this has been set aside, let no one pass judgment on you with regard to keeping of the Sabbath or feasts or anything such as that, because those things have been done away with through Christ. And when we think about the Lord's Day, first of all, the Sabbath was done away with. But number two, let's talk about the significance of Sunday in the Bible. What makes Sunday such a unique day in the Scriptures? First and foremost, we remember that Jesus arose on that day. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four gospel accounts mention Jesus rising from the tomb early on that day. And Jesus said himself in Luke's account, it was written that the Christ should suffer and rise from the dead. Jesus said that was something that was prophesied to happen. So Jesus arose from the grave on a Sunday, but that Jewish day of Pentecost that we read about in Acts 2 when all those people were gathered in Jerusalem, that always fell on a Sunday. In Leviticus 23, we learn that. In Leviticus 23, 15 and 16, you shall count 7 full weeks from the day after the Sabbath. Well, what's the day after the Sabbath? The Sabbath is the 7th day of the week, and there are 7 days in a week. Therefore, the day after the Sabbath has to be the first day of the week. So, when you read about Peter preaching that sermon in Acts chapter 2, that occurred on a Sunday when all those people obeyed the gospel that day. The third thing that happened on a Sunday was that the disciples met for worship on that day. Don read for us a moment ago, Acts 20, verse 7, when Luke wrote that Paul and others gathered together to break bread. Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and prolonged his speech until midnight. You remember that collection was something that was done every Sunday by the Christians in the first century. In 1 Corinthians 16, Paul told the church at Corinth, on the first day of the week, each of you is to put something aside and lay it up. ESV says first day of every week. The Jewish Sabbath was done away with at the cross. Sunday held significance. But number 3, I wanted to ask this question. Did the disciples eat the Lord's Supper every Sunday? Was there a weekly communion, or was it quarterly or annually, or how did they do it? Well, you have to go to the Scriptures, don't you? You have to go through the various passages about the Lord's Supper and see what you combine in light of those. First, we need to make this point. Jesus commanded that the Lord's Supper be eaten. Jesus said, and this you'll see this on Lord's tables here and at other places where the communion is sitting, do this in remembrance of me. So if he says do this, that means a command, doesn't it? Jesus said it's to be done, but if we just took that passage and we didn't have any other information, well, we're not really told what day or when to do it. But that's where we go to those other passages to learn when and the frequency of doing it. Because we know where to assemble. Hebrews 10:25 mentions that, right? Not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. We know where to assemble. And we know that those first century Christians assembled to eat the Lord's Supper. In chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians, Paul mentioned that they came together at a time when ordinarily they ought to eat the Lord's Supper. So evidently they had set aside a time to eat the Lord's Supper on a Sunday, but he said they were making it a common meal It was become something that was done more to feed their bellies than anything else, than observe it as that sacred rite of the church. R-I-T-E, not R-I-G-H-T, right? But in 1 Corinthians 11, beginning at verse 20, he said, "When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat, for in eating each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. What, do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way also he took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" He kept saying, "when you come together," in that passage. So the church in Corinth had a frequency of coming together. But we also learned they came together for the purpose of eating the Lord's Supper. Because notice verse 33 in that passage. When you come together to eat. Eat what? Well, to them they were eating a common meal. Paul said when you come together to eat, it's to eat of the Lord's Supper. And Acts 27, 20 and verse 7 said that it was on the first day of the week they gathered together to break bread. That on paper ought to settle the matter, right? That ought to provide us enough information about when they did this, but I wanted to take this last little bit to talk about something that some have claimed about Acts 20 and verse 7. Some say that Acts 20 verse 7 refers to just a common meal instead of the Lord's Supper. It must be talking about a common meal, some say, because the fruit of the vine is not mentioned allegedly. But if it's talking about a common meal in chapter 20 and verse 7, it's talking about a common meal back in chapter 2 and verse 42. That was after about 3,000 souls obeyed the gospel after Peter's sermon. And it said the church in Jerusalem were all together and had all things in common. Luke said they devoted themselves to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. Now, what's significant about the breaking of bread instead of a breaking of bread? Has to be talking about the Lord's Supper. That's the same construction you find in Acts 20 and verse 7. And that's the position that Bible scholars of different religious backgrounds have taken about Acts 20 verse 7. Regardless of how often they took it themselves in their religious bodies, they said that's talking about that communion meal. Some have looked at this passage, though, to say that it's in reference to a common meal that people have. And some look at verse 11 in Acts 20 as a reference to it being a common meal. Acts 20 verse 11 says, when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. This is after Eutychus, remember that fellow that had gotten sleepy when Paul was preaching, fell out the window and died, and now Paul comes back up here. Luke says he talked some more and then he departed. Some think that the Lord's Supper started in verse 7 of Acts 20. It was interrupted by Eutychus falling out of the window, and then it resumed in verse 11. I don't know that I take that position, because notice verse 11 again. Paul is the only one breaking bread in verse 11. But verse 7 says, when we were gathered together to break bread, so not sure that it's the Lord's Supper delayed and being continued down in verse 11. And verse 11, eaten, the word eaten in verse 11 means to taste. How many eat the Lord's Supper just to get a taste of it? Well, no one in here partakes the Lord's Supper just purely for the taste, I don't think. That'd be a little strange, wouldn't it? And according to verse 7, how long did Paul preach until in Acts 20? At midnight. So if it's the Lord's Supper that's being taken in verse 11, what day is it if it's after midnight? It'd be Monday. You don't read about any Christians partaking of the Lord's Supper on a Monday, do you? So I'd be cautious about saying that's the Lord's Supper continued in verse 11. Seems to be iffy there. But what do we engage in on any given Sunday as this congregation and other congregations like us? Well, we've sung, we've prayed some. We've spent some time studying the Bible. We're about to give in a few moments as we've been prospered. And we partake of the Lord's Supper with the right spirit. And if you're here this morning and you're not a child of God and have that desire to become one, we would encourage you to do that and put Christ on in baptism and have your sins forgiven and be added to his church. If you're here and you need prayers for something, anything in your life, whatever need that you might have, we'd ask that you come now as we stand and as we sing.